there is a requirement, if you like, for practitioners to be really good listeners and to actually take the time to get to know the people that they're interacting with.
Welcome to Process Pioneers, the show that takes a deep dive into the minds of decision makers, key influencers, and process experts who are pioneering the world of everything process. Welcome to the next episode of Process Pioneers. My name is Daniel Rayner. I'm the host of Process Pioneers. And in each of these episodes, I have the absolute privilege of sitting down with industry experts, process practitioners, process specialists, those that have been putting BPM into practice day in and day out in their organization. And if you're joining us for the first time, a warm welcome to you. We are into our episode 160 something. I don't know the exact number, but we have got many episodes there and many episodes for you to go back and learn from and glean from that we've captured over the last couple of years. And if you have been with us for some time now, then we'd really appreciate a rating or a review. That's going to help us continue to spread the podcast to all of the people that are interested in this particular topic, whether it's students coming out of university or people in organizations that are looking to find their people. And that's one of the feedback I received more recently about this podcast. We had there was a lady that was working in a large organization here in Australia, and she was about to exit the process space. Obviously, a long story short, about to exit the process space. No one in the organization really understood the value of process management. So she was thinking, okay, what else can I kind of jump to? Stumbled across this podcast, found her people, learned a lot, was able to start implementing things at an organization, and she's really started to embed a process-centric culture and mindset across that organization. So I think that's just fantastic to hear and fantastic to hear that this little podcast can play a little part in that journey. So in today's conversation, I have the absolute privilege of sitting down with Charon Abbott. Now, Charon is the head of business services at Allianz Partners Australia. We have had Charon on the podcast before. We're just saying before, I can't quite remember exactly how far back the episode was, but there's another episode there that we've done with Charon. Very excited for today's conversation. Charon, thanks for joining me.
It's an absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me back.
And I think one big topic that we haven't really done a deep dive in on this podcast series yet is this idea around the human versus the technical element of business process management. And I think, and I want to dive into that today because I know that you understand the value of the human element, the human side. I think historically, when we talk about business process management, a lot of people would think of that maybe the more of the technical side. Maybe it's run and owned by the IT department or the IT area of the business. People get really focused on different methodologies and different notations and different modeling languages and what visually, like what does the process look like? What is the data telling us? All of this sort of stuff, without understanding or maybe without giving as much emphasis to the human element or the people side of it. So, it's a big topic, but let's scrape the surface of it and dive into it a little bit. Can you tell us a little bit let's start off with your experience with the human versus technical side of business process management?
Yeah, I think for me, I've been a people leader since I was 19, which was quite a while ago, I'm afraid. But for me, when you look at a process and you have to bring people along that journey, it doesn't matter what process I've been involved with, none of them are fully automated. There always is an element of people needing to be involved. And even if they were fully automated, you still need people to implement them. So actually taking the perspective of the people who have to engage in the either the change or the process itself. And I think sometimes we forget the people who are implementing, and we only focus on the end user, we would normally call them. that we miss an opportunity to get full buy-in. And I've seen projects fail because they haven't taken into account the actual people side of things. They've either been heavily compliance-based or, heavily weighted towards the requirements of one particular department, or, that for me is a great wasted opportunity. And from a change management perspective, we shouldn't be thinking just about that being an outsourced job to give a change manager. It needs to be considered holistically and by whoever's involved in that project from end to end. It's not a job that can only be given to somebody to do training and comms. It's much more deeper than that. It's about really getting people enthusiastic about the change, about feeling involved in the change. That's a massive part of it, and that takes time and effort. And so it's easier not to do it. But the changes that I've seen that have been really successful are the ones that actually invest the time and effort in bringing people along the journey. And you can argue that, yes, it does take a bit longer, but the change is sustainable. So in the long run, it saves you money.
100%, yeah. And I think that it doesn't take long to think of the many people that are involved in even just a simple process. Obviously, within a process, you've got many different factors, many different people involved, different systems and applications and risks and controls and policies and all of these different things and artifacts that we're capturing. At the end of the day, there are people that are accountable for that. There's people responsible for that. There are different subject matter experts that are involved in each step of the way in a process, even if they're not necessarily the ones that are physically acting out the process. They do have a part to play. And then we've got the process owner or the person that's responsible for the performance of the process and bringing them on the journey as well. So the human side of it, it's such a big part. And I think we need to be able to leverage that. And how have you seen how have you seen that people leveraged well in the sense of the process management, process improvement work being done, where we're not just relying on a core central team of process specialists that, they're doing all of the work. And then at the last minute, it's like, surprise, these are all the changes we've made. But people have been included right from the start, and we're actually leveraging the front end operational employees and managers and people from all different aspects of the process. We've included them as well. How have you seen that played out really well?
Yeah, the thing for me, first of all, you have to work out who your stakeholders are, and I've had many a conversation and seen things go fairly badly on some projects and well on others, where we haven't identified all the relevant stakeholders. That's not always easy, but there are ways of doing that. And so you need to understand who you're dealing with initially, and also where how much of an impact of what you're doing is having on them. One of the things that I think that we don't do very well, and there's I have thoughts around this, is everyone in a company has KPIs. How often in process improvements do we consider what those KPIs are and how they align with what we're trying to achieve? because quite often I find that people go, oh, those people are difficult. And when you actually start looking at a massive array of things, but particularly KPIs, they're the easy part. We often forget that we may be asking somebody to do something that's misaligned with their objectives. So that's something that I've seen not done very well. But if you've got an idea of what they are, you can either realign or make sure that as a practitioner that you understand and can communicate how the changes will benefit those KPIs. So that's quite a good way of approaching a change, which is quite simple to implement. So a lot of it is really about asking people of their views. So if whenever I've done a process change, I will always sit down with the people who are mostly impacted, not exclusively, but when you sit down with them and understand their views on the change, what their fears are, what they're excited about, and also involving them, because someone once said to me, people don't like change happening to them, but they're okay with change. They're fine with change. And one of the things that we have increasingly seen is the world that we live in now is constant change, which people can find scary and exhausting. So the more control that people feel that they have over a change and that they're being listened to, the more successful I've found it. Plus, you get better outcomes because these guys are the people that know what's going on.
Yeah, that's so true. That's so true. I think that it's so important that everyone feels like their voice is heard, and that they can contribute, and that there might be things that, without being in that role, we can't fully understand or fully experience what it is to be in that position and to perform that work and to encounter the challenges and the obstacles and the hurdles that they encounter. And so giving them that opportunity, even if at the end of the day, because obviously, as we've mentioned, there's many people involved, many different priorities, many different probably conflicting ideas in some cases. But I think step one and most importantly is make sure that everyone's heard, everyone has their voice heard. We collect that data, we collect that information, and then we work with them to come up with the best possible outcome. And I think that if people do feel heard and can see that some of their contribution has made its way into the final outcome, or if it hasn't, at least we as the process practitioners, the process people, we've got a bit of a grid or a bit of understanding, bit of context for where the different stakeholders are coming from, and that enables us to have those conversations.
100%. That's exactly right.
Yeah. And so I think that with many different people involved in a process, different personalities, different leadership style, different ways that people respond, how do you go about, because I think unless this is a field that you've studied and you understand psychology and maybe an element of HR and things like that, and you understand people, how can we as process specialists, upskill ourselves in this area to better to better work with and collaborate with people of different personalities, with different drivers, with different motivators, with different perspectives on these things?
Yeah, that's interesting, and so which I didn't mention earlier, but I'm currently I've developed a tool for assessing engagement risks. So there are various aspects the risk engagement. It could be length of service, it could be personality, it could be the type of role that people are in, etc. And in my master's research, we identified 32 different elements, and with my PhD, which my application's in at the moment, that we're going to develop tools for people to use, which hopefully will help with some of that.
Right.
So that might help you identify where you've got potential risk areas with certain types of stakeholders. But from a more generally, I think that there is a requirement, if you like, for practitioners to be really good listeners and to actually take the time to get to know the people that they're interacting with. Understand their objectives, but also understand what's important to them. And I think this is one of the advantages in most organisations with BPM is that you tend to have multiple projects and you're building on relationships. So that like these things happen over time, but it's important to have the non-technical and non-process conversations. If I go and see someone and need to understand, say I'm process modelling something, the first thing that I say to them is not, what do you do? What's the first step? It's like, hi, how long have you been doing this? Who are you? That, and just get to know them as people. And that tells you an awful lot about who you're dealing with, and you can glean that. If you go in purely focused on the technical aspects of what you need to get done, you miss out on an opportunity of understanding your colleagues, but also that you miss out understanding the human side of BPM and what change approaches might work better for the individuals, yourself and the organisation. So I think it's important to build relationships, and that's sometimes people have seen those as wastes of time because, you're chatting with people. No, I'm building a relationship.
Yes. Yeah. No, that's great. That's really important. I think that, depending on the conversation that we're having and what we're asking of someone, they're either going to end up doing the bare minimum to, meet the requirement, or they're going to fail to meet that requirement because it really isn't a priority, or they're going to want to go above and beyond. And I think depending on our interaction and how and what that relationship looks like will determine the input and the effort that goes into what we're asking of people. And I can even reflect on my own life. Like as you're talking, I'm thinking about when different people ask me to engage in something, to be involved in something, to commit to something. I would say that depending on my relationship with that person I'd be lying if I said it doesn't have an impact on the amount of effort. Like there's certainly some activities that I will intentionally and proactively go above and beyond for. And a lot of that comes down to that relationship. So it makes a whole lot of sense. And I think if we're trying to bring people on the journey, we want them to be, running the race and keeping up with us, not us having to drag them along and kicking and screaming type thing. But yeah, Sharon, sorry, you were going to add something?
All I was going to say was that people are also want to do a really good job. And so we have to be really good at communicating and interacting with our stakeholders as to how the changes that we're doing help them do that. And part of that is them hearing and being heard and having that contribution. But I've had situations where people have thought somebody was a blocker and had been obstructive. That person didn't see that at all that way. They felt hurt that they hadn't been involved, and they were equally as passionate about delivering for their customer. So, there are opportunities, but we do have to take the time to listen to people.
No, that's good. That's good. And just one last question before we wrap up, and just on the back of that, how can we, because we've got, an audience listening to this, and I'm sure for some of them it's been a really insightful conversation. How do we practically become better listeners? Because I think different people will have a different understanding of, or maybe a different perspective on what a good listener is. And it's not just hearing someone. Listening is so much more than that. So can you talk to us about what are some practical ways that we can get better at listening?
Yeah, one of the things that I've found most useful is I've had the opportunity to do some training as a coach, and it teaches you to ask better questions. So we often ask very closed questions. I never, and this for process improvement audience might be shocking, I don't ask the question why. I think why, but I don't say why, because that can be quite threatening to people. So if I say, why did you wear that shirt today? You immediately become defensive and will have to try and justify your decisions or what you're doing. Better questions are, I'm really interested in your shirt, Daniel. Tell me how, tell me more about it. Or the questions that are open and let people go down a path of sharing as opposed to justifying. So I think that asking better questions, but also leaving space to hear the answer. Don't try and jump in all the time, and with your next thing. And we often are thinking about our next question before the person stops speaking. And I'm guilty of that. I'm sure you are. We all are, and I'm not professing to be a world expert on it, but it's things to be conscious of and try to let things play out and be comfortable with some silence, so that you make sure that you have fully focused and been 100% present with the stakeholders. And clarify questions if you don't understand of what they're saying. So if you play that back to someone, then that's a way of making sure that everybody understands.
That's great. That's awesome. And I was just trying to look for a book then, because, as you're talking, I was just reflecting on the conversation we're having and how important it is that we know how to engage with people. We know how to build those relationships. And there was a book I was reading recently, and I thought it was on my desk here. Yep, it is. 1 second. And I highly recommend it for any of our listeners that are tuning in. But it's called How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. And it's not a new book. It was written in the 1930s, but I would say some timeless principles here about how to win friends and influence people, and just story. It's a very easy read. It's just story after story of examples how people were able to influence their conversations, their circumstances, and ultimately get win-wins for everyone. It's not about manipulating other people, but it's about how do we work best with others? How do we bring people on the journey and empower people to go above and beyond and believe above and beyond than maybe where they're at right now. So I'd highly recommend that book for anyone that wants to continue to dive into this topic further. But Charon, I just want to thank you for sitting down with me today, because I think it's really insightful to be able to hear from someone that is living and breathing this every day. And as you mentioned, you don't have all of the answers, but I don't think anyone does. And I think, we can all learn a lot from someone that is working with many people, working with many stakeholders of all different types of personalities and things like that. And obviously it's been a very brief conversation. We've only been able to scrape the surface, but I've certainly gleaned a lot from this conversation, and I'm sure our audience has as well. So again, thanks so much. It's been an absolute privilege.
Thanks for the opportunity. It's been a pleasure.